Ian McKelvey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to speak on the final reading, or the third reading, of the Geographical Indicators Wines and Spirits Amendment Bill as it passes through the House. And I guess it is a little bit of a misnomer calling this bill a 2016 bill, as it was first passed in 2006 and, as the previous speaker said, never brought into force. But exactly, good things do take a lot of time, and Mr. Speaker, it's nice to speak on a piece of positive legislation that adds value to an industry on the move. 1.6 billion to the New Zealand economy, and growing at a rate of around 10% a year. It's going to be very interesting to follow that growth over the next few years. And I think the other really interesting point about the wine industry, and if you look back at Marlborough perhaps 30 years ago, I think I've said before in this House, it looked very like the walls of this House. Marlborough now is a very different place, and it just shows how regions change as the fortunes of food I guess beverage industry changes in New Zealand. It makes a massive difference to what goes on in those regions. And having listened to the last couple of speakers, in the House, Mr. Speaker, I feel a little out of it because I wasn't invited to the wine awards. I do taste the odd wine, but I clearly am not quite up to the wine growing skills of the next speaker on my side of the House, and the blackcurrant growing skills of what I imagine might be the next speaker on the other side of the House. And I guess you could make some sort of a fermented beverage out of those blackcurrants. But Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss of me, and I know that the next speaker on our side of the House will talk about this at length, but it would be remiss of me not to mention the massive earthquake that has affected much of the northern South Island's wine growing area, particularly the Waipara and Awatere regions, both names which may at some future date become registered as geographical indicators. And we can only wish them well and assure them that all in this House will do everything possible to expedite their recovery. The bill originally rose, as the previous speaker said, out of an obligation under the World Trade Organisation Agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, obliging New Zealand to provide protection for geographical indicators. A geographical indicator indicates that a wine comes from a particular region, or a Scotch whisky, for example, comes from Scotland, and I assume it must be made using a product from Scotland. And likewise, champagne comes from the Champagne region of France, and these are hugely well-known names that have been around for generations and generations. I don't know anything about that stuff, Oz. Whilst we have a couple of wine growers in the Rangitikei region, I find it unlikely that we'll see a geographical indicator registered in the name of Rangitikei. However, Mr. Speaker, we will see in due course, I think, other sorts of food registered, not under this bill, but under a bill that I'm sure will come to this House at some stage in the future. And if you look around New Zealand now, you have, in fact, you can, I think, on the menu in this House, you can actually buy a thing called Rangitikei chicken from time to time. You can also buy taupo beef. And taupo beef, of course, came about as a result of the changes to the environmental regulations around Lake Taupo. Taupo beef originated out of that, and it was an attempt to prove that they could, grow beef economically under the new environmental regime that ruled the verge or the catchment of Lake Taupo. Proved very successful. And I think that we'll see in the future, and there has been some discussion in the course of this bill, as there often is in the Primary Production Select Committee, some discussion around the opportunity for us to introduce a bill in the future that will provide for the opportunity to register geographical indicators around all sorts of other food. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that's a pretty important point for us to remember. But that's getting away from I guess, the object of this particular bill, and I'm sure I'll get there before you remind me of that. But this bill, as has been noted by the Minister and certainly by the Speaker, David Shearer, afterwards, is an extremely important piece of legislation from a New Zealand perspective, and it will make a big difference going forward to our ability to attract, market and secure, I guess, or protect the regions of New Zealand and perhaps even those individual, I guess, towns or place names throughout New Zealand as we move forward, particularly in the wine industry, but also in other forms of spirit production, and I guess that would apply to black currants. So during the course of the Select Committee process, we did make a couple of three basic changes to it, and we talked about the opposition procedures, which is really someone's ability to appeal something. And so that was one of the significant things we dealt with. We also talked at length about the cultural issues and how we might look to protect cultural, values in the potential, or as we move through the potential to register those geographical indicators. And also there was some discussion about the renewal periods. In other words, the first renewal after 5 years, and subsequent to that, those renewals will take place over 10 years. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Select Committee for robust discussion around most things that weren't related to this legislation, but nonetheless we had robust discussion on a lot of issues. I also want to congratulate or thank the industry, because during the course of the submissions on this bill, we had some very competent submissions, and all of an ilk to support it. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to this becoming legislation.